No institution has proven to be more pivotal to America's productivity and prosperity than public education. The strength of our workforce, the vitality of our democracy, both depend on our willingness to sustain a thorough and innovative system of free public schools. Yet, at this time, the increasing demands of a global economy and the challenges of a changing society have strained our schools and the brave men and women who work in them. Schools aren't factories, and students aren't widgets. The silver bullet approach to school reform, the suggestion that we can or should transform public education just by charterizing it or voucherizing it or privatizing it, that approach is doomed to fail. The real work of improving student achievement is tedious and hard and often expensive, but it is worth it. What keeps most teachers up at night, what leads them to invest most of their spare time and a lot of their spare change in this profession, is the challenge of reaching a student who might otherwise be lost. The joy of awakening a mind to a new idea. That's what drove these talented men and women behind me to teach in the first place. Their work is in our interest as well, but we will continue to lose effective teachers if we demonize and demoralize them, if we saddle them with the blame for society's shortcomings and strip them of the resources they need to succeed. It is time for those who want to improve our schools to focus on the essentials of education. Those were Diane Ravitch's words in a book called The Death and Life of the Great American School System. She wrote, "We must make sure that our schools have a strong, coherent, explicit curriculum that is grounded in the liberal arts and sciences, with plenty of opportunity for children to engage in activities and projects that make learning lively. We must ensure that students gain the knowledge they need to understand political debates, scientific phenomena, and the world they live in. And we must be sure that they are prepared for the responsibilities of democratic citizenship in a complex society." I've dedicated much of my own career to teaching as well. I spent time in Central America and here in the community colleges of Colorado. In fact, I believe I've spent more time in the classrooms of this state than any other candidate in this race. I have worked hard as a policymaker to expand opportunities for all Coloradans. I led the fight for high-quality early childhood education so that more students can start school ready to learn. I worked to provide a more stable learning environment for homeless children so that they can remain in the same school over the course of a year, even as their families are shuttled from shelter to shelter. And I fought for higher education so that the doors of Colorado's community colleges and universities remain open to students from low and middle income backgrounds. That ought to be a priority for all Coloradans as well. In 2007, I led a statewide tour of Colorado schools, especially in our rural community and some of the poorest districts of this state. I recognize that many of our aging school buildings pose a risk, a health or safety risk, both to students and to staff. So I worked with our state treasurer, Carrie Kennedy, I'm proud to say a supporter of mine, a supporter of public education. She and I worked together to produce the Building Excellent Schools Today, or BEST Act. It is the largest investment in school construction in the history of Colorado. $1 billion plan. It is a $1 billion plan to transform Colorado's crumbling classrooms. And I just want to pause on this point because I want you to know what drives my work, much like those of the teachers behind me. When I began this tour about 3 years ago, I met a young woman in the San Luis Valley who had done really well in history. I know that history is not often the sort of subject that entitles students who achieve in it to a spot on the wall of the local pizza parlor, which is where we put the pictures of the winning sports team. But it's the sort of subject that we ought to be encouraging kids to excel in, just like arts and music and social studies and sciences and math. And this student had done so well in history that she qualified for the state competition here in Denver. She got here and she was very proud of the presentation that she had put together, and she should have been. But when she came to the big city, she was blown out of the water. because the kids she was competing with had access to all sorts of high-tech tools and bells and whistles and technology and computers and PowerPoint presentations, tools that just weren't available to her in the San Luis Valley. She came home, she told me, and I met her at the school she attended there, and she said to me, "I'm not going to try anymore." She said, "It's too embarrassing. It's too humiliating. I don't want to go back up to Denver and be embarrassed like that ever again." And I thought about that a lot. I thought, what kind of a lesson are we teaching a young woman like her in a state like ours that we don't value her education? That's what she asked me. She said, "How come you folks up at the Capitol don't care as much about me as you do about one of your own kids?" I thought that was a pretty sobering question from a young woman who deserves a better answer. So I went back to the state capitol, put together a coalition of folks to pass this investment in school construction, this billion-dollar plan to repair and rebuild and modernize schools. We called it BEST because we wanted to make it really hard to vote against. And only one guy did. The bill passed the House by a vote of 64 to 1, or 64 to Bruce, as we like to say at the time. I tell you that story not because the woman who drove that piece of legislation, that little girl, made a contribution to my campaign. I didn't ask her for one. And not because she had hired a lobbyist to advance her interests at the state capitol. She shouldn't have to. And certainly not because she had formed a political action committee. We had to value her, not because of her net worth, but just because of her inherent worth as a human being. That's what's been lost. That's the same spirit that will drive my work in the U.S. Senate. I will continue to fight to strengthen our schools so that every child can fulfill his or her full potential, and to put real meaning behind the slogans that so often pass as public policy in Washington, D.C. When we say no child left behind, we ought to make sure that our schools have the resources to achieve those goals. I'll work to close the achievement gap, to enhance America's competitiveness on the global stage, to help make the federal government not a source of punishment, but a more effective partner to states and school districts and students and teachers who are struggling to achieve. Here are my priorities, and I believe priorities that all teachers in Colorado share. We ought to prepare kids for kindergarten by investing in high-quality early childhood education. We ought to provide teachers and principals with the time and training and technology and professional development they need to succeed. We ought to align standards and assessments so that students and parents and educators receive accurate and useful and timely information. We ought to develop rigorous, research-based curricula that prepare students for post-secondary education and employment. We ought to expand access to higher education, including community colleges, career and technical education, four-year colleges and universities, by increasing the availability of work-study funding and other forms of financial aid. And we ought to encourage parental involvement and community support. We ought to integrate healthcare and daycare and other social services. We ought to tackle all the challenges that kids increasingly bring to school instead of expecting our schools to make up for all the places where society has fallen down on its job. At the end of the day, I believe we can make this state in particular, and America in general, a place where people around the world dream of teaching. That ought to be our aspiration. We ought to treat this occupation as the profession with the respect and compensation and support it deserves, so that we continue to attract and retain and train the most talented people from across America in what is, in many ways, the most important profession of all, educating our young men and women, the future of our country. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your support today.